So we stand in a kind of odd and unusual place in the liturgical calendar. We have the end of the Paschal period, the 40 days, which is like capped off by the Feast of the Ascension. And then we have, which that's at the 40-day mark, and then the 50-day mark, which is where Pentecost is. We have this 10-day period. In this period, we're not singing Christ is risen, but we're also not singing the hymn, O Heavenly King, which which we stopped there at quite a while ago. And so it's this weird place. It's like you're in between, like Jesus isn't here and the Holy Spirit isn't here. And so it's this weird sort of like limbo space, right? And there's a lot that could be said just on that alone of sort of the phenomenon or the experience of sort of in liminal spiritual spaces, right, that you find yourself in your spiritual life. But in this particular period, we have a reading in the gospel, which is a very theological reading. It's one of Jesus' prayers to the Father, and it really focuses a lot on Jesus' relationship with the Father and that unity that's there, and that unity creates a shared life, right? Everything that is mine is thine and thine is mine, and this idea that unity creates this sharing, that whatever is yours is mine too. It's a really good just definition of unity, is that it's a sharing of sort of properties and possessions with other people. It's a shared life. And so that's important, and he prays for the unity of his people, right, the disciples, that they would be one as the love of the Trinity is one, right? So that there's this imitation, that the life of the Trinity becomes something that we are somehow imitating or participating in, even in this life in some way. It becomes the model of what unity and love looks like. But then there's a lot of talk about truth in all of this, talk about unity in this prayer that Jesus gives, this idea of truth. And I think the way to think about why that is, one of the reasons why this is mentioned in this context where God is talking about his unity and his love, right? And we can also say that there's not a whole lot of difference between unity and love in this context, right? Like that, what does it mean? Like, how do you get to unity? Well, it means love. What is love? It's like, it's a unity. It's a shared life, right? There's this sort of co-identification with the other. But this emphasis on truth is interesting. And one of the ways I can think, I can just kind of cut to the chase real quick of why it matters is that you can't have unity unless you have truth, right? You can't be unified under some sort of falseness or some sort of like delusion. If you have, for a good example is that maybe you have a friendship or a romantic relationship, but if it's based on a lie, or there's some sort of deep dishonesty or falseness, then there's not real unity, right? And so this is really critical of like, if I want in my spiritual life unity with God, right? Or we want unity with one another, the road to that is radical honesty and truth. And the way you think about truth, is we'll often think of truth as sort of like, like abstract content, like in a very kind of propositional manner. Like it's like, okay, if this, then that and that, or I posit these 5 truths about God, and so I sort of, assent to them in some way. And that clearly matters. I mean, we commemorate the first 6 ecumenical councils on this Sunday. So we obviously know that like putting down clear, precise, binding, explicit expressions about who we think God is matters, but it doesn't matter in and of itself, right? And I think a way to help get us there is sort of to expand our understanding of what we mean by truth. So if we use the word true in some interesting ways. One of them is, we'll say like, oh, he's a true friend, right? What do we mean by that? What we mean is there's something that he's, right, that he's, sort of really, truly, and honestly what it means to be a friend. And it's getting at this idea of like a lived truth, right? That truth is something not just that you sort of know like, that's false and that's true, but that you're able to sort of live that out, right? That it doesn't just occur in your mind, but it occurs throughout your entire body, right? So it's sort of an enfleshed or incarnated truth. And so the question we should ask ourselves is what value does truth have for me if I'm not able to manifest and live that out in some way? And this gets at sort of what we think about what the whole theological heritage that we have is, right? Is it's not about, it's obviously not about system building or being right or having all the right kind of answers for everything in life. Like, oh, if I just become Orthodox, I sign up to this program and I just have like an automatic, just like, a printout sheet just comes out and I have all the right answers about everything, like, metaphysically or something or morally. That, there are a lot of answers, right? But that's really sort of missing the point, because the point is sort of not just to have those, but to be those things, right? And so it's really moving from sort of a way of relating to people and truth as like I have truth versus I am truth, right? In terms of like sort of being and having here. And so this idea of living this truth out matters, because if we're not being true to ourselves, if we're not being true about God, if we're not being honest about our relationships with other people or ourselves, which, let's be frank, we are all very dishonest with ourselves all the time because we're very afraid, right? We're very afraid of what's real, of confronting it, and the possible sacrifice that might be necessary for that. Sometimes we're fearful of the truth because we're afraid that we're not in a place where we're actually safe to be vulnerable enough to love and to be united to people. That because this unity that Jesus talks about with the disciples, unity like that's dangerous, because the path to unity means some degree of vulnerability to get to that point of unity and love. And so sometimes we're afraid to be really honest and truthful because we're afraid to get hurt, right? And if we've been hurt a lot in the past, that makes it even harder, like down the road. We have to sort of reconcile and redeem that harm that's been done to us in some way. And so being true is a hard, precarious thing, right? But it's at the center of, we know that without that we can't get to real unity, right? Because it's not real unity if it's based on some sort of lie. And so this is why the spiritual life always begins and ends in this moment of radical honesty before God. That I am going to be truthful and honest with myself about my own doubts, about my own fears, about my own hopes. That if I'm honest about those things, then you can begin, right? God can begin to have a relationship with you once you've sort of cast aside all the BS, right? And so this is the real point of truth. And so when we have these this doctrinal tradition we have, about the Trinity and all these councils and the things that laid out, the point of those is not so much to give us the right answers that we can just sort of, pull off a shelf and like put in our little theology bag we can carry around with us, But the point is really to give us is when you have a structure of truth, it shows you where to look. Right? The way I think about it is it's not so much that Orthodoxy gives you all the right answers, is that it gives you the right questions. And if you look at like Nicaea and all these councils, what they're doing is they're trying to say, what exactly is the divine? What is God exactly? Right? And narrowing it down and saying, well, it's not these things, right? But what it does is when you narrow things down and you produce constraints, you actually open up the possibility for, an adventure of some kind. Maybe a good way to think of this of like, theological constraints, like when we say, well, God's not this or this or this, he's this thing. When we do that, it's sort of like rules in a game. Like if you establish rules in a game, well, now you can play a game because you have limitations of some kind. And so it produces it. You can think of a genre like this, like maybe it's fantasy or it's horror. Well, they have like conventions in a genre. Like you have certain types of characters and certain types of plots and certain types of settings. And these things help create, right, the kind of storyline that you would have. And so then you're able to get something interesting and unique and distinctive because you have some sort of limitations there. And so these limitations, right, create all this possibility. And so what this theological tradition does is it's like it orients us. It doesn't give us all the answers, but it puts us on the right path and in the right direction. It gives us the right questions. And I think, truth is found in figuring out how to ask the right question, right? A lot of times we don't get the answers we want because we're not asking the right questions, in the same way that we don't find the lost object because we're not looking in the right room, right? And a lot of times it happens once we get the right question and we ask that question, the answer, this is very common, the answer almost immediately erupts. Like the minute you ask the right question, the answer immediately echoes back. And so this happens with questions. This is why questions are powerful. And so this is helpful to focus on like what does the tradition give us, it gives us the good and right questions to ask, right? The questions that open up repentance, that open up possibility, that open up real transformation. And so when we think about this theological tradition and how it gives us truth, yes, it gives us truth, it gives us a truth that demands us to participate in it and to live it out, right? And so that's what we get with this, is we get a beautiful conception of God that, because it's narrowed in certain ways, right, opens up this whole possibility for being able to have a relationship with God, because it's based on truth, right? And so it matters, right? Like, this is part of the whole conviction and sort of commitment to truth, is that I'm committed to sort of being rigorous, the rigor and the discipline and the difficulty that is required to being true and truthful and seeking out what's true. And the fathers did this, right, in times past. They said, well, certain questions matter. Certain things, the specifics of it, sometimes maybe if we don't fully understand the tradition and the philosophy behind it, might seem petty or sort of like arguing over very minor, minuscule things. But the reality is that when you're trying to figure out what matters, usually it's like one or two little things out of a whole sort of background of noise that actually matter. And figuring out what questions, right, are like hinges that, like, depending on whether you take this side or that side, some things really do like create a parting of ways. And so having the discernment to know what those things are is a very difficult thing. But we're given a sort of inheritance that helps us along the way with that. Ultimately, if we want this unity, we have to be truthful, right? We want unity with each other. We want unity with God. We have to be truthful. We have to be honest about ourselves. And we have to come to God and come to other people exactly as we are. And that honesty, right, opens up possibility. In the same way that the truth of the ecumenical councils and our theology does the same thing. It opens up this vision and this direction that we can actually travel, right? It's like all of a sudden we see another path in the woods open up for us, right? And this is a path, this is the path of truth, right? Well, the only way to have that truth is to walk down that path and to sort of manifest and live out that truth. And so the truth that Jesus is speaking about that we find unity in is the kind of truth the kind of truth that we speak of when we call someone a true friend. And that is ultimately what Jesus is looking at. Right before he ascends, he says to his disciples, I no longer call you my servants, I call you my friends, right? And friendship is really based on truth. And that's what we're asked to do. And the theological tradition is there to help us be more truthful, honest people, because that's the only place where we can actually be in touch with what's most real, right? When we're honest about it. And that's how real unity and relationship with God and others begins and ends. Lord Jesus Christ.
Lord,